We've spoken a bit about institutions, and you talked about how you chose a data set beginning from the 1500s, because that's where most of them begin. But you also talked about that being a particularly instrumental time for strong institutional governance norms within the West, which then helps transform the West from previously, a fair to middling economic powerhouse, as it were, not a powerhouse, but an economic competitor, to all of a sudden stronger institutions led to much better economic outcomes, all the technological advancements you talked about. What is a sound basis for an institution? So when you talk about proper role of government and strong institutions, what are those characteristics that you'd expect to see and be promoted?
Yeah, I think this element of neutral rule of law is sort of a classic idea going back to at least Adam Smith and Hume. That's really crucial, right? And that gets at this sort of loosely Northern versus Southern European angle. Is when you get into power, is your goal to basically, do you spend most of your time just making sure you help your buddies out? Or do you spend most of your time saying, I have some neutral rules I need to enforce? I'm not naive about this. I know there's always some continuum of the two. But being willing to neutrally enforce rules is, I think, central to modern good institutions. Then the cliches, all the sort of Adam Smith cliches, right? Peace, easy taxes. These are real peace, easy taxes, and a government that enforces routine property rights in a mundane way. These are things that are reasonable. I have to say that economists have been looking for a long time for evidence that high tax rates really totally destroy economies. And it's pretty tough to find it. Like, compared to when I was a younger person, I placed much less weight on tax rates per se, and more weight on the ability to start and stop businesses, hire and fire employees, basically legalizing building. So the things that a lot of the progress studies folks look for. And having that happen through neutral rules that just let people do stuff is important. So what's often known as permissionless innovation. That's really important. In a lot of countries, it's just hard to get things done. So,
a really interesting example of strong institutions, plus that point you've made about Chinese diaspora in particular being very economically productive and good with institutions, is Singapore. So exactly, former British colony, an economic powerhouse in its own right, full of a Chinese diaspora that are Singaporean. Mm-hmm. And as we've been touching on points of tripwires for institutions, like, for example, the over-promotion of ethnic diversity that might lead to some kind of conflict or less cooperation, is there was a story recently in the press with the Singaporean Prime Minister where the story was about him closing down a Stanford University campus in the country because, and this is his quote, he said, in the West, they've got a movement called wokeness where you are super sensitive about other people's issues. It leads to very extreme attitudes and social norms, particularly in some academic institutions and universities. And I wonder, is this response down to his ethnic Chinese traits, or because of the governing roots of the country that was seeded by the British colonial administration? I suspect we've become institutionally weaker since those points based on some of the things we've spoken about. What do you think might be behind that response? Are other countries just less tolerant of these new ideological mutations because, it's not part of that? They've got a strong immune system against it. It's a Western thing and it doesn't translate. Or is it something else? Is it to do with cultural traits?
It's hard to diagnose an N=1 case, right? So there are multiple causes. So I don't know what the Prime Minister of Singapore's personal reasoning was, but I can tell you that a central part of the history of Singapore has been, how do you manage ethnic diversity, right? That they've known this for a long time, and that it's going to be a difficult thing to manage. And the three major ethnic groups the one would think of in Singapore today would be the majority is currently ethnic Chinese, right? Mostly diaspora folks, multiple generations overwhelmingly, and then folks from the Indian subcontinent, and then Europeans. Those would be among the economically dominant groups, right? People of European descent. And just managing that level of diversity has been difficult, right? And Lee Kuan Yew basically encouraged a lot of forms of assimilation and neutrality. And one thing that Lee Kuan Yew says in his memoirs, I'm sure he gave a lot of speeches about it, was that a very important decision he made was to make English the language of the country, not Chinese. By making English the language of the country, it was nobody was being favored. Basically, everyone, all the large groups were being equally disfavored by the decision to use English. And so that's the kind of linguistic neutrality, in his view, was an important part of creating a successful multi-ethnic culture. Now, an additional thing that works in Singapore's favor is that it's a country where people on average are just really smart. The new PISA scores in math came out and Singapore was at the top by a lot. These are averages. These aren't like, the top 5%, but just the average person in Singaporean school is really smart. And smarter people on average are more able to handle the costs of managing an ethnically diverse society in a reasonable way. So having sharp folks and making some big institutional decisions that reduce the likelihood of ethnic conflict, that's what has to happen. I think he's right that basically the wokeness movement, for whatever its benefits are, and there are some, has the cost of basically dialing up the cost of ethnic diversity, right? It just makes it a more salient in each and every decision in daily life. And that's a cost that is not trivial. And so Singapore has made a lot of decisions to try to reduce the cost of ethnic diversity, and not through homogenizing everyone, but there's some of that. But making, like I said, choosing English is a sort of galaxy brain choice that ended up probably solving a lot of problems and preventing a lot of problems that we never have to talk about because the decision was made decades ago.
Earlier on in the conversation within the book, you talk about how a smart thing to do to have an economically productive country and strong institutions would be inviting a bunch of Chinese over because they would be able to do that.
For sure, yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah, the poorest countries. Because I suppose thinking about this from a British perspective and knowing how former colonial governments were once considered, we've got a small number of European elites here who are pulling the strings of the economy, is whilst I think there is probably a more balanced view of that than we perhaps give it credit for, but clearly not particularly liked. And no one really liked that there was this alien elite that was running the show. Would there be a danger there, thinking about that civic conflict that can arise, that by inviting in, even if they are very high performing, very intelligent foreigners to effectively rise the ranks over multi-generations, that being your policy, that you're inviting a kind of colonialism on a country which wouldn't necessarily be accepted over time? And I'll put a bit more color on this question. There's a relatively well-known passage in one of C.S. Lewis's books where he talks about how he agrees with Chesterton that, and I can't remember the quote exactly, that there's some kind of an uneasy feeling, a sense of loss when you are governed by those who are not your own, which I thought was interesting because he was writing at the time of colonial administration. So I don't know if there was some kind of empathetic feeling toward those who were under our suzerainty, as it were, in Britain. What do you think might be the long-term consequence of that? I know Africa are allowing the Chinese to run lots of things within African countries at the moment with regards to business. Do you envisage some kind of civic conflict that you'd be inviting on, even if it ends up being a better economy?
Yeah, well, I mean, one response to this is that this is what we did in North America, and it made the United States and Canada vastly more productive. And it meant that they became nations that could create innovation that would grant gifts the whole world over, right? So the European migration to North America ended up indirectly giving massive gifts to the entire planet. And was there cultural loss? Were there horrors that were visited? Yes. And at the same time, the world that we exist in now is a world that benefits on a regular basis from innovation, from technological excellence that very likely would not have existed otherwise. Another way to put this is that the poorest countries in the world are are just so, I mean, the level of poverty, the incredibly low level of infrastructure, of healthcare is so low that some risk of ethnic conflict is worth paying, is worth taking on in order to be 2, 4, perhaps 8 times richer, right? The poorest countries in the world, if we just do like the 90th, 10th percentile to the 90th, that's about a 25x difference in income per person. And that's adjusted for all the funny things you'd want to adjust for. So basically, in the world's poorest countries, it's worth the risks of serious ethnic conflict. It's worth some people feeling sad that people who look like them aren't the most dominant people in the economy at times, in order to have running water that works and a medical system that's much more functional than beforehand. If the Chinese diaspora is making Thailand and Malaysia like obviously far richer than they would be otherwise, and more countries should sign up for that prescription.